Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling a topic it's definitely sparked a lot of debate over the centuries. We're going to be looking at the reasons why women might cheat.
It's a question that people have been grappling with for, well, probably as long as relationships have existed.
Exactly. And we've got some pretty fascinating source material to help us unpack this. Well, let's just say it's a complex issue. We've got everything from ancient biblical stories to Victorian era scandals, all the way to really personal accounts from women today.
It's interesting to see how these themes kind of echo across time.
Totally. And speaking of themes echoing across time, maybe we should start with, well, how about those biblical stories?
Yeah, those are definitely, let's say, thought-provoking.
Definitely. Like, take the story of Gomer. What always struck me was how, well, on the surface, it seems like a straightforward case of infidelity.
Yeah.
But then you start to consider the societal context, the lack of agency women had back then.
And it makes you wonder, right? Like, what was really going on beneath the surface?
Exactly. Like, was it really just about, a lack of love for her husband? Or was it more about, well, maybe seeking some kind of fulfillment or control in a world that didn't really offer women much of either?
That's a really good point. I mean, even in those ancient stories, you can see how societal pressures played a huge role in shaping women's choices.
Absolutely. And fast forward a few centuries to, say, the Victorian era, and those societal pressures become even more intense. Like, imagine a time when women were basically expected to be, well, basically perfect wives and mothers. No room for, like, personal ambition or desires outside of that.
And any deviation from those expectations was met with, well, pretty harsh consequences.
It's kind of hard to even wrap your head around that level of, well, restriction. No wonder some women might have sought outlets for, self-expression, even if it meant taking huge risks.
Exactly. And in that context, infidelity takes on a whole new meaning, right? Like for some women, it might have been a form of rebellion, a way to kind of assert some autonomy in a system that denied them any.
It's almost like a quiet act of defiance.
Exactly. And it just goes to show that infidelity, well, it's not a new phenomenon. And often it's rooted in these deeper personal and societal issues.
For sure. And it's interesting how those historical examples kind of set the stage for some of the themes we see emerging in more modern stories, like the ones in that The Lost Tapes podcast episode, if you listen to that.
Oh, absolutely. That episode was, well, it was incredibly insightful.
I was so struck by how candid those women were about their experiences. It
Yeah.
really, well, it humanized the whole issue in a way that I don't think statistics or generalizations ever could.
Totally. Hearing those personal accounts really brings those complexities to life.
Okay, so let's actually dive into some of those individual stories.
Yeah.
I think they'll really help us, unpack these themes. Like one story that really stuck with me was Rachel's. She talked about how in her marriage, she felt more like a caregiver than an actual partner.
And that feeling of, well, emotional neglect came up again and again in the episode.
Didn't it? Rachel actually said, and I'm quoting here, "I didn't cheat for excitement. I did it to feel appreciated again."
And it's not just about a lack of affection, right? It's about feeling unseen, unheard. Like your emotional needs just aren't being met in the relationship.
Exactly. And that makes you wonder, like, what are those patterns of communication or lack thereof that kind of create this dynamic?
That's a huge question, right? And it makes you think about, well, how can we create relationships where both partners feel safe expressing their needs? And more importantly, where those needs are actually heard and acknowledged.
That's something I bet a lot of our listeners are thinking about right now. It's not always easy to cultivate that level of, open and honest communication, but it does seem pretty crucial to preventing those feelings of disconnect that can, well, sometimes lead people to seek fulfillment elsewhere.
Absolutely. And it's not just about talking, it's about actively listening, right?
Mm.
And responding to our partner's emotional needs. Even small gestures of appreciation and acknowledgement can make a huge difference. So true. Okay, so we've got emotional neglect. But there's another theme that came up that I found really interesting, the need for validation. Like I'm thinking of Linda, who was 55 and started to feel kind of invisible in her own life.
Yeah, Linda's story was powerful.
It was when someone else came along and made her feel attractive and desirable again. It was like a wake-up call for her. She even said it made her feel alive in a way I'd forgotten.
It's that human need to feel seen and appreciated, right? Not just for, like, the practical stuff we do, but for who we are as individuals.
For sure. And it makes you wonder, like, how can we, especially as women, cultivate a sense of self-worth that isn't so dependent on external validation, especially as we age, you know?
That's such a big question, and it's one I think a lot of women grapple with. It's about reclaiming our narratives,
Mm.
defining our own sense of beauty and worth, finding fulfillment in ways that go beyond just, how other people see us.
I love that. It's an ongoing journey of self-discovery and acceptance. Absolutely. And sometimes that journey, well, it might involve seeking validation outside of our existing relationships, even if it means, making choices that come with complications.
Right, and those choices aren't always easy or straightforward. It's a reminder that infidelity, well, is often a lot more complex than just, a simple right or wrong decision.
Absolutely. It's a tangled web of emotions, societal pressures, and personal struggles.
Okay, so we've got emotional neglect, the need for validation, but there's one more theme that I really want to dive into: the longing for intimacy.
Yeah, that one was definitely a common thread throughout those stories.
It was, and I keep thinking about Jessica's story. She talked about how she was in like a seemingly good marriage, but she just felt like true intimacy was missing.
And she wasn't necessarily looking for like excitement or just physical gratification. She was yearning for that deeper emotional connection.
Exactly, like she was searching for that feeling of truly being seen, understood, cherished, and sadly, she found it outside her marriage.
And that raises such a crucial question, right? How do we cultivate and maintain that kind of deep connection within our long-term relationships, especially amidst, the routines and responsibilities of everyday life?
Right, like how do we prevent those embers from fading away?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Whether we've experienced infidelity or not, I think it's something we all ponder.
It's a reminder that relationships need constant nurturing, a willingness to prioritize intimacy even when life gets busy.
Couldn't agree more. And it's not always about those grand romantic gestures either. It's about the small, everyday acts of love, kindness, and attention that really keep that spark alive. It's about creating that space for vulnerability and emotional honesty.
It's so true. Listening to all those stories really made me realize that sometimes, even within those seemingly good relationships, there can be these undercurrents of unmet needs, and those unexpressed desires can lead to, well, let's just say people seeking fulfillment in places they maybe hadn't planned on.
It's a good reminder that every relationship has its own unique challenges.
Definitely. And it's like this constant dance, right? Finding that balance between nurturing our individual needs and maintaining that sense of connection with our partner.
That's a great way to put it. It's a dance that requires communication, understanding, and a willingness to evolve together as a couple.
Well said. So we've covered emotional neglect, validation, and intimacy. Are you ready to unpack some more of these recurring themes?
I'm ready. There are a few more stories I think we should definitely discuss. I think they'll give us even deeper insights into this whole topic. It's like we're peeling back the layers, And each story reveals a little bit more about what might drive someone to make these kind of tough choices.
Yeah, it definitely makes you realize there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Hmm.
Speaking of which, there's another story I wanted to bring up, Lori's story. She talked about how after years of focusing on her family, being a wife and mom, she suddenly hit 40 and kind of woke up one morning feeling totally lost.
Like she had no idea who she was outside of those roles.
Exactly.
That's something I think a lot of women, especially those who have been, stay-at-home moms or really dedicated themselves to raising their kids, can relate to. Like you pour so much of yourself into those roles, and then suddenly you're faced with this, like, who am I now?
Yeah,
Question.
right. It's like those societal expectations almost push women into these predefined boxes.
Totally. And it can be really hard to break free from those boxes.
They can. And Lori's story kind of highlights that.
Mhm.
For her, it took a pretty unconventional path to sort of rediscover herself.
Yeah, she had a brief affair, which, obviously comes with its own set of complications. But for her, it was almost like this spontaneous rediscovery of parts of herself she'd kind of buried for years.
It makes you think about how sometimes, even in those, quote unquote, good relationships, there can be this lack of individual fulfillment.
Right. Like you can love your partner, be committed to your family, and still feel like a part of you is missing. And sometimes those feelings can lead people down paths they hadn't anticipated. It doesn't make those choices right, but it does, add a layer of complexity to the whole issue.
I think that's such an important point to remember. It's like we can't just dismiss these stories as, simple cases of right and wrong. There's always more nuance to it than that.
Absolutely. And I think Lori's story encourages us to be more intentional about, creating space for self-discovery and personal growth, like throughout our lives, regardless of our relationship status.
I love that. Like, it's not selfish to prioritize your own growth, right?
Not at all. Actually, it's kind of the opposite. When we invest in ourselves, when we feel fulfilled as individuals, we bring so much more to our relationships.
Right. It's like that whole you can't pour from an empty cup thing.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about, losing yourself in those societal roles and the importance of, like, reclaiming your own identity.
Yeah.
But there's another aspect to this whole theme that I think is really interesting. The need for, well, let's just say it, independence.
Yeah, that definitely came up a lot in those stories. And it wasn't always about, like, wanting to be single or end the relationship. It was more about craving some sense of autonomy.
Right. Like, I'm thinking of Nina. She talked about how she had always been this, like, perfectionist, always playing it safe.
Mhm.
And then she had an affair with someone who kind of brought out this, like, adventurous, spontaneous side of her.
Like a whole different side of her personality she hadn't really tapped into before.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it wasn't like she was trying to, replace her husband or anything. It was more about reclaiming those parts of herself that she had kind of pushed down for so long.
I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? Like, we all have those parts of ourselves that we maybe haven't fully explored or expressed.
It's like she needed that experience, even though it was, unconventional and maybe even a little messy, to kind of jolt her awake.
It's like sometimes you need to step outside of your comfort zone to really figure out who you are and what you want.
And sometimes those boundaries, those comfort zones are, well, they're kind of imposed on us by societal expectations.
Totally, especially for women. Like, there's this pressure to be the good girl, the responsible one, the one who always plays it safe.
But what happens when that need for safety and control starts to feel, I don't know, suffocating?
That's a great question. And it's something that, let me think. Oh, yeah, Grace's story really highlighted. She was in this loving, stable marriage, but she felt totally smothered by her husband. Like, he was always trying to control everything.
And the affair, for her, wasn't about finding someone better. It was about, like, carving out some space for herself.
And creating some breathing room.
Exactly. And it makes you think about how important boundaries are in relationships. Like, even in those, really loving and committed relationships, we all need a certain degree of autonomy.
We need to feel like we have some control over our own lives.
Right. Like, we're not just extensions of our partners.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of those traditional ideas about what it means to be a good wife can kind of work against that. Like, there's this expectation that you should always be available, always accommodating, always putting your husband's needs first.
And that can be a recipe for disaster, right? Like, it's not sustainable in the long run. You end up losing yourself in the process.
Totally. And Grace's story, I think, really challenges that narrative. It suggests that real intimacy, like true connection, requires respecting each other's need for independence.
For sure. It's about finding that balance between, being a couple and being your own person.
Okay, so we've got self-discovery, we've got breaking free from societal expectations, and we've got the importance of autonomy.
It's like we're creating this, like, roadmap of the female experience, with all its twists and turns and unexpected detours.
I love that analogy. And speaking of detours, are you ready to explore a few more of these stories? I think there are some really powerful insights still to uncover.
It's amazing how, like, even with all these different stories, we keep seeing those same themes pop up over and over again.
Right. It really shows you how universal these experiences are, I guess.
For sure. And I think there's one more theme we should touch on. It came up in a few of those stories, especially the ones from women who are, a little bit older.
Oh, you mean like Carla?
Yes. Carla's story is a great example of this. She talked about how, after she retired, she kind of felt lost. Like, she spent so much of her life focused on her career, and suddenly she had all this free time and, well, she didn't really know what to do with herself.
And that's when the affair happened.
Exactly. And it wasn't like she was unhappy in her marriage, it was more like she was searching for something, I don't know, something to make her feel alive again.
Like she'd lost her sense of purpose.
Right. And I think that's something a lot of people experience, not just women, during those big life transitions, like retirement, empty nest syndrome, even just, changing careers. It can really throw you for a loop.
Makes you question everything.
It does. And sometimes those feelings of, like, uncertainty and lack of direction can lead people to make Well, let's just say impulsive decisions.
So they might not make otherwise.
Exactly. And I think Carla's story is a good reminder that, those big life changes can be tough on relationships. It's important to communicate with your partner about what you're going through to support each other.
And to prioritize self-care, right? Like finding healthy ways to cope with those feelings of feeling lost.
Absolutely. Like exploring new hobbies, reconnecting with old friends, maybe even seeking therapy if you need it. Anything that can help you kind of rediscover your sense of purpose.
And maybe prevent you from, making choices you might regret later.
Exactly. Speaking of choices we might regret, I keep thinking about Alyssa's story.
The one who always described herself as the good girl.
Yes. She had always been like the perfect wife, always put her husband's needs first. But then she had this health scare, and it really shook her up. Like, it made her realize how short life is, and she started questioning if she was really truly happy.
And that's what led to the affair.
Right. She had this deep longing for, like, passion and intensity, something she felt was missing in her marriage. And after her health scare, she couldn't ignore those feelings anymore.
It's like she was suddenly confronted with her own mortality, and it made her reevaluate everything.
And it makes you think, right, like, what are those unspoken yearnings we all carry around inside us? Those desires that maybe we've pushed down for years.
It's almost like a wake-up call,
It is. And it can be scary, but it can also be really liberating. Like, it forces you to be honest with yourself about what you truly want out of life.
And to find the courage to go after it, even if it means, breaking some rules or challenging those societal expectations.
Exactly. And, I think that's what all these stories really boil down to. It's about recognizing that our needs are valid.
And that it's okay to want more out of life, whether it's more passion, more independence, more validation, whatever it is.
Absolutely. And that finding healthy ways to meet those needs is essential, not just for our own well-being, but for the well-being of our relationships, too.
So I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've talked about emotional neglect, the need for validation, the longing for intimacy, the desire for independence, and even, the impact of major life transitions.
It's been quite the journey. And I think, if there's one big takeaway from all these stories, it's the importance of empathy.
Absolutely. Like, it's so easy to judge other people's choices, especially when it comes to, something as emotionally charged as infidelity.
But these stories remind us that there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
And that everyone's journey is different.
Exactly. So next time you hear about someone, making a choice that you don't understand, maybe try to pause for a second and ask yourself, what might be going on beneath the surface? What might their story be?
Such a good reminder. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration. We hope you found it insightful, thought-provoking, and maybe even, a little bit challenging.
Keep those conversations going, folks, because the more we understand each other's stories, the more compassionate and connected we become.
Beautifully said. And until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deeper.
Dive into the shadows of human nature with the Lost Tapes podcast, where the truths hidden beneath our daily lives are brought to light. We uncover the layers of complex relationships, hidden emotions, and raw realities, from mental health to life's hardest truths. No topic is off limits, no story too raw. The Lost Tapes podcast is your invitation to understand the unspoken facets of life. Join us and let's explore life's hidden sides, one story at a time. Don't miss out on more hidden truths. Subscribe now to the Lost Tapes podcast. Stay curious. Stay informed. Click the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to never miss an episode.